What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be talking about some potential stashes that you can throw on to the end of your bench going into week 8 of the fantasy football season. There's lots of injuries and bye weeks to navigate, so maybe you have some extra space on the back end of your bench. Maybe you don't, but if you do, these are the names I would be paying attention to. So without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these stashes. All right, so as we do every week, I do have a list of priority stashes. These are players we've talked about potentially on the waiver wire episode that we do earlier in the week, maybe also players that we talked about stashing last week, but they've crossed over that 40% rostership threshold. So if you're maybe in a little bit of a shallower league, maybe you're just in a league that isn't as competitive, these are names I would still be looking for if they're available because they should be picked up in most leagues. That's going to be Tez Johnson, Evan Engram, Kayshon Boutte, Joe Flacco, Sam Darnold, K-Dot, and Tyler Algier, and Tajay Spears. But going into my first overall stash, somebody below that 40% threshold, it is going to be Troy Franklin, wide receiver for the Denver Broncos. Now, he's only rostered in about 29% of leagues at the moment. He does have a very good upcoming game here against the Dallas Cowboys, who are ranked dead last against fantasy football wide receivers. So if you're looking for a guy who you could pick up right now underneath that 30% threshold, where next week people might be clamoring or trying to go get him off of the waiver wire because he has a big game against this week's secondary here in Dallas, I think Troy Franklin is certainly a player that you can look at. And if you're struggling with some bye weeks, maybe you're also struggling with some injuries, I do think this is a player that you could be picking up off of the waiver wire right now this week, a little bit under the radar, that you can plug into your lineup in your flex spot and maybe get some production out of here in this game against Dallas. Now, another player you should pick up, and a guy that I would definitely be trying to go grab, is Brashard Smith. We talked about him on the waiver episode. We've talked about him on some stash episodes the last couple of weeks. Look, the Kansas City Chiefs have talked about getting him a little bit more involved into this offense. We saw it happen a little bit last week, still rostered in just about 30% of leagues. I think this is a player who's trending up as the pass-catching running back in this offense. He gets a matchup this week against Washington on Monday Night Football, so definitely a player I'm keeping an eye on. Yes, the Kansas City Chiefs are a team that I think could potentially be buyers at the running back position going into the NFL trade deadline, but Brashard Smith profiles as the best pass-catching running back in this offense, and I think that has some value here in Kansas City. So let's go to my next guy. My next guy is going to be the wide receiver position, Jaylin Noel for the Houston Texans. Now, he is a player I'm definitely looking at because Nico Collins is in concussion protocol, and Jaylin Noel is coming off of one of his best games of the year last week in week 7. So he gets this matchup against San Francisco this week. He's a player I'm definitely looking at as a potential pickup option. I don't know if I'm comfortable playing him in my lineup this week, but I think he is a very talented player and somebody I would be keeping my eye on. It's kind of the same role that Christian Kirk would play in, so you got to kind of keep an eye on Christian Kirk as well. But Jaylin Noel is a very interesting wide receiver pickup, I think, if you're looking for some rookies who do get that, second half of the year kind of blossoming that we see sometimes. So Jaylin Noel is one of those candidates for me. Let's go to another player. I think at the tight end position, Isaiah Likely is a player you should be looking at picking up potentially going into the week. Now, Isaiah Likely and the Baltimore Ravens have one of the best rest of season fantasy football schedules for the tight end position. So he's a player I definitely like. We've had some Mark Andrews trade rumors as well. If they lose this week against Chicago and they kind of fall to that 1-6 record, could they be sellers and maybe potentially moving off of a guy like Mark Andrews? And Isaiah Likely is the beneficiary of that rest of season schedule. That's kind of what I'm playing with Isaiah Likely here. Obviously, he started the year injured, been worked in a little bit more. We saw a season high last week as far as snap shares go, so he's definitely a player trending up, only rostered in 14% of leagues, definitely worth the pickup if you need some tight end help. Now, another player you can add is going to be Malik Washington for the Miami Dolphins. We talked about him as a pickup a couple of weeks ago, and it hasn't really come to fruition. However, Darren Waller moving to IR makes him even more interesting because now no Tyreek, now no Darren Waller. Is it just going to be Malik Washington eating up some of the under short yardage type of throws here for Tua Tagovailoa? I think Jalen Waddle is definitely going to be a beneficiary of that as well, but I think Malik Washington is interesting. Gets a tough matchup this week on the road at Atlanta. They're very good against the wide receiver, so maybe not a pick up and play type of option for you, but at 22%, I'd like to see how he performs this week with Waller out of the lineup and see if he gets a couple extra targets coming his way here in this game. Now, another tight end you could pick up is going to be Colston Loveland. We talked about him just a few weeks ago as a post-bye bump for the rookie. We did see that kind of happen just a tiny bit. Colston Loveland this week at Baltimore is an interesting pickup. We have a Cole Kmet back injury as well. So is that going to open the door for Loveland? I think it's certainly a conversation we need to be looking at and potentially be having here as the Chicago Bears continue to try and build around Caleb Williams. I think Loveland's supposed to be a big part of that. At 23% rostership percentage and the position being what it is at the tight end, I do think Loveland needs to be picked up and stashed. Let's talk about Darius Slayton. Darius Slayton at 20% roster percentage going into this week here on the road at the Philadelphia Eagles. He was a guy that we really talked about as the primary pickup when we had Malik Neighbors go down to injury. The problem was Darius Slayton suffered an injury himself, so he missed some time there for the New York Giants, but now he's healthy again. He is tracking towards playing. He's a player that I think is going to be a big play threat in this offense with Jackson Dart, and some of that Lil Jordan Humphrey usage that you have seen in this offense, I think is going to go right over to Darius Slayton. So certainly a player worth watching. Obviously, Jackson Dart has been playing phenomenally to start his career, definitely exceeding the expectations. I think Slayton is a player that we should be having on the radar because ever since he had that injury, I think people kind of forgot about him in this offense, and we should just kind of be looking right back at Darius Slayton now as the number one outside wide receiver for Jackson Dart. Going on to my next guy, I do have Xavier Legette here for the Carolina Panthers at 23% rostership percentage. He's a player that should be getting looked at. It's going to be Andy Dalton under center this week. At least that's the way it looks like it's tracking right now. So Andy Dalton under center means good things for Xavier Legette, just a little bit more consistency from the quarterback position. Jalen Coker back into this lineup, going back into the slot. You have Tedero and McMillan on the outside as well. I think this is an offense that maybe isn't good enough to have a ton of receiving options be viable, but we saw a big game from Legette last week. So if you're trying to follow that, see if Andy Dalton can help him stack 2 games on top of each other. If he goes out and gives you another one, I think he's certainly going to be one of the more talked about waiver wire ads. So try and just do it a little bit early. If he doesn't do anything big this week, you just drop him and move on to the next guy going into week 9. How about 2 more running backs to finish this off? The first one being Isaiah Davis here for the New York Jets at 15% rostership percentage. He gets a great matchup at the Cincinnati Bengals, who are very bad against the running back position. Now, Breece Hall's a little bit banged up right now. Does seem like he's questionable heading into the weekend. I do think he's probably going to play, but we had that report about the Jets potentially being sellers heading into the NFL trade deadline, and if that is the case, I think Breece Hall is certainly a trade candidate. We've heard those rumblings. Could Isaiah Davis be the de facto last number 1 guy on this offense, I think, as the running back position, obviously until Braylon Allen gets healthy, but I think Isaiah Davis certainly worth stashing at the minimum in case we get a questionable that turns into an out with Breece Hall this week, and then long term, obviously, if there's a trade, maybe you have a piece here who has some value going into the rest of the season. Now, my final player I do think we should talk about is going to be Devin Neal for the New Orleans Saints. Rookie running back, only 13% rostered. This is the Kendre Miller replacement in this backfield. Kendre Miller was seeing some of the early down work. Obviously, Alvin Kamara was also being used. I do think Kendre Miller getting knocked out of this for the rest of the year is going to be a bump for Alvin Kamara, but Devin Neal is going to be the next man up, like I said. Certainly a productive running back at Kansas. Obviously a player that some people really liked in this year's draft process. He was a polarizing prospect, I think, because some of the analytic profile wasn't the greatest with Devin Neal. So that said, I do think Devin Neal is certainly going to be a player that does get some work this year. Does that mean that he's going to get all of it throughout the back half of the season? I don't think so, but maybe he gets some goal line work and some things like that. So certainly somebody we could pick up and see what he does with the new opportunity that he has here for the New Orleans Saints this week. All right, folks, so there you have it. That is 10 players that I'm picking up and stashing going into the weekend if I have some extra roster space. If not, no worries. I get it. The bye weeks are crazy this week. People are calling it Bye-Mageddon, the Bye-Apocalypse, whatever you want to call it. It is a crazy week of bye weeks. Also, if you count the other priority stashes, there's probably more than 10 for you to go check for on your waiver wire. So if you found something today informative, entertaining, and or actionable, do me the favor, hit the like button. Also, make sure you guys are subscribed to this channel. You don't want to miss any of the future content that we got coming out. Q&As, waiver shows, trade shows, all of that good stuff hitting your inbox if you're subscribed. And go join our free Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with your fantasy football teams 24/7, 365. But with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today. So I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.